This course, entitled Mixing plus Mastering, demonstrates the process of mixing and mastering simultaneously. I will mix and master 3 different songs of 3 different styles of music, so you'll gain a broad perspective on how to apply these techniques and processes. This is the metal band rock track. The song is called Money Talks. The drums are the red tracks. The bass is the blue track. The electric guitars are the green tracks, and the vocal tracks are yellow. For the first part of this video, I'm just going to roughen a mix using just the faders and pan controls, and a very basic mastering signal path. One of the purposes of the Mixing plus Mastering course is to show you that if the tracks are produced well, as detailed in the Origins of Sound Qualities course, the results you get using just faders, pan controls, and some basic mastering can be surprising. And when you use mix processing, as described in these video tutorials, the result is even better. I will now spend a few minutes roughing in the mix using just the faders. The pan controls are already set for these tracks. I'm not using any type of formula. I'm just going to turn up the kick drum level and then work my way from the left side of the mixing board to the right side of the mixing board, turning up each fader's volume until it's at a good level relative to the other tracks. Next, we will listen to the mastered reference mix to see if our rough mix is close. The level of our new mix will be low because no mastering loudness has been applied to it. Our mix was also dull and muddy because there were no equalizers used on any of the tracks, and because no mastering EQ was applied to it like it was with the mastered reference mix. A basic mastering channel plug-in signal path can look like this. In the top slot, A noise-influenced equalizer is used to brighten or to adjust some particular problematic frequencies in the mix. That's followed by a look-ahead limiter, a distortion device, a reference track AB switcher, LUFS metering, and finally a dithering plugin. Now I'm opening up the look-ahead limiter and adjusting the threshold to raise the overall level of the mix. Notice I turned off this limiter's automatic release control because it causes a lot of bass distortion, as shown with the Audio AB machine. Ideally, the release time should be above 100 milliseconds to keep the bass distortion under control. If your look-ahead limiter has an adjustable hold time that can be set to 10 milliseconds, then you can use faster release times without increasing bass distortion. The loudness level is close to our reference track, but the overall EQ is very muddy and dull. We'll now open up the AB reference switcher and compare our mix to some selected tracks that have balanced frequency responses. This comparison switcher, which is called M-Compare, is made by Melda Audio Productions. I've loaded 4 slots with 4 reference tracks. Tracks 1 and 3 are commercial releases that sound very good for their genre, and they're very loud and clear. The reference tracks loaded into slots 2 and 4 I recorded at my studio, and I'm familiar with the way they sound, their frequency balance, their loudness, and such. So as I'm mixing and mastering this rock song called Money Talks, I'll listen to the reference tracks to cue me in on different frequencies that are problematic about the mastered mix we're working on. The reference tracks loaded into M-Compare are basically showing us the same thing that our reference audio clip on track 25 was showing us, and that is the mix we're working on has a muddy, unclear sound. Under normal mixing conditions, equalizers are applied to the individual tracks to clear up any particular muddiness or mid-range buildup. But for this demonstration of using the faders and pan controls to create a mastered mix, equalizers on individual channels were not used, and we will only use an overall mastering EQ to clear up the main frequency balance issues with the mix. If your mix is well balanced, as is with our 24-track fader-only mix of the rock metal band song Money Talks, you can create a good starting point for your mastering EQ of the mix by using an EQ that has the ability to match your mix's EQ curve to the frequency curve of pink noise. The yellow EQ line plot that was just captured is of our 24-track rock mix during a representative part of the song where all the instruments are playing. I have now selected the pink noise EQ curve as the reference curve to match our 24-track rock mix to. Note that I'm not going to match it 100%. I'm only going to match it to the degree that it needs to be matched so that the overall frequency curve and balance is more natural. Check the EQ plugin you're using with the Audio AB machine to determine which settings create the least amount of undesirable artifacts. The brighter mastering EQ made the vocals too loud, so we're going to turn down the vocals. This is a perfect example of why it's a good idea to learn the process of mixing plus mastering simultaneously. The mix is going to sound notably better when we apply some individual channel processing. But first, I want to make the point that if your tracks are produced well, you don't need much processing at all for your mastered mix to not sound out of place when it's played alongside commercially released recordings. You may have noticed the mix we're working on needed more high-frequency EQ. Being able to hear differences in frequency EQs is an important skill to develop. EQ issues will be covered later in more detail. Our 24-track rock mix was also a few dB lower than the reference track mix, so I reopened the limiter to increase the overall loudness level a few more dB. If your loudness levels are sufficient, you can simply use look-ahead limiter settings, as shown with the Waves L2 limiter, to make all the songs of the album project you're working on reach the loudness level you're going for, as measured using the LUFS metering device on one of the bottom insert slots of the master channel. On an individual track level, the main issues with the Money Talks multi-track were the drum hit inconsistencies on the kick and snare drum and the overabundance of lower mid-range on the guitar room mics. Also, the bass guitar and vocal tracks needed compression added to them to keep them more steady in the mix. To make the drum kit mix more steady, we're going to sample kick drum hit and a snare drum hit and load them into triggers on the kick and snare drum tracks respectively. If you're recording a real drum kit, it's a good idea to record some drum hits from that drum kit in a blank area so you can sample the sounds later if need be. If you try to use drum sounds from a drum library, it can sometimes sound unnatural. It might not fit as well with the drum kit you're mixing. If you try to take a sample from within the track, you'll often get too much cymbal bleed in the drum mics. That's why you need to record some hits at the end of the song in a blank area so there is no bleed from the other drum sounds on the drum sound that you're going to sample for the trigger. Now I'm going to insert the drum triggering device on the kick drum and snare drum tracks. I already loaded in the kick drum sample from the end of the song into the kick drum trigger, and I loaded in one of the snare hits from the end of the song into the snare drum trigger. I adjusted the snare drum trigger's threshold so it fires on all the snare drum hits, and adjusted the trigger time so that it's fast enough to trigger a flammed snare hit. There are a couple of snare drum rolls in the song Money Talks. Even if the velocity sensitivity of the snare drum triggering device was automated to follow the snare drum's dynamics, it still wouldn't sound natural. So as described in the Origins of Sound Qualities course, I'm going to automate the bypass on the snare drum trigger during the drum fills, and I'm going to turn up the snare drum track during the roll, and use the original snare drum fill at those points during the song. Now we're going to turn down the trigger drum sound so that it matches the level of the real snare drum fill that precedes it. Now we're going to work on the kick drum and snare drum sounds. The kick drum has a little too much decay, so we want to shorten the decay of the kick drum sound. It'll make it more punchy in the mix and give some more room for the bass guitar to be heard. Now we're going to EQ the snare. It could use a little bit more low-end punch and a little bit more treble on it. There's also some lower mid-range build-up, so I'm going to boost the mid-range and sweep it to zero in on the offending frequency and then pull it down a little bit. To give us better control over the instruments, we're going to subgroup the tracks. All the drum mic channels are going to go to a drum subgroup. The The bass track will go to a subgroup. The guitar tracks will go to a subgroup. And the vocals will go to a subgroup. Now we're going to add a compressor to the bass track and adjust it to keep the bass more steady. Now we're going to copy that setting to the vocal tracks because it's already pretty close, and adjust it so it's not squashing the vocal, just keeping it steady. And now we're going to add a compressor to the drum subgroup just to keep the hits a little bit more steady in volume. Next, I'm going to take out some lower mid-range frequencies on the guitar subgroup. You may have noticed the room mics on the guitar, which were being adjusted at the 2-minute and 45-second mark of this video, overemphasized the lower mid-range frequencies around 300 to 400 Hz. I'm going to search for the particular frequency by boosting a narrow band with this equalizer and sweeping it until the problematic frequency becomes apparent. And after I find it, I'm going to pull it down a few dB. Now I'm going to add an equalizer to the vocal subgroup to take out a problematic lower mid-range frequency, using the same technique in equalizer as was used on the guitar. You may have noticed that every time the singer sings the word talk, he kind of screams it. I'm going to try to use a multi-band compressor on the vocal track to even out those screams. Now we'll add some effects to the vocals, such as reverb and quarter note delay. Now we're going to add some short reverb to the snare drum to complement the room mic sound. Now we're going to turn the mastering plugins back on, so the sound is going to jump up louder, about 7 to 8 dB.
I'm on a roll, I take it all. Dead man's hand, your blood, I'll call money child. I miss that shit war. She got TC money child. You better walk. Spin that wheel, around it goes. Where it stops, the lady knows. I'm on a roll, I take it all. Dead man's hand, your blood, I'll call money child. She won't. Money child, you better walk. On the line, my daddy's so hot, it's party time. Who is lucky? And now we see. And God would trust, not you and me. Money child, who she won't. Money child, you better walk.
Continuing to refine the mix, I added a sidechained dynamic equalizer to the bass subgroup so that every time the kick drum hits 100 Hz or so is ducked on the bass guitar track. This lets the bass drum punch through the mix a little bit more. The bass drum track should be turned down a little bit to compensate. The snare drum is also a little bit loud, and I didn't automate the snare drum triggering device to be bypassed on any of the fills except for the one at the beginning of the song. Other things could be fine-tuned about the mix, such as having the bass guitar a little bit louder. But the main production issue with the current version of this mix is there are 2 kick drum hits that are a bit off time during the instrumental part. Those kick drum hits should be edited so that they're more in time with the rest of the track. Nonetheless, this demonstration video covers all the bases you need to know.
I'm on a roll, I take it all. Dead man's hand, your blood, I'll call money child. Bullshit war, money child. You better walk. Spin that wheel, around it goes. Where it stops, the lady knows. I'm on a roll, I take.
Now we'll save our mix as a new version and export it to the mix folder so that it can then be loaded into the CD burning software. It's a good idea to look at the mastered waveform at this point. You may find that maybe some peaks were clipped off. You shouldn't see any flattened peaks on the snare drum hits. And you also might want to check to see if the intro levels are too low. Sometimes if a song starts off with just a guitar break for the intro, you may need to automate that guitar level to be louder so the beginning of the song doesn't sound quiet if it follows a loud song in a sequence on the album. If you're exporting a mix to be mastered in the traditional way, where the mastering is a separate process from the mix, simply bypass the mastering plugins and export the mix in 32-bit float WAV file with no dithering. Check that your output levels have peaks no higher than -4 dB full scale. Next, we'll mix and master the rap recording and then the country music recording, using the same concepts, techniques, and processes demonstrated with the rock band recording.